Well, welcome to 2021, our January 27th webinar that we're starting off the new year with. Our webinar today, the topic is recovering from a global pandemic, and we're specifically dealing with this concept of when will this be over? Organizations most often plan for recovering from a natural disaster or a fire or other more normal crises, but how do we recover from an emotional impact of a global pandemic? And I think as we're going on, you are seeing that there is more and more of an emotional impact. So how do we overcome what's now called pandemic fatigue? How do we re-energize an exhausted organization? In this webinar, we're going to discuss strategies for leaders to minimize and address burnout and pandemic fatigue. My name is Linda Nelson. I'm the ICOR president. I serve on the U.S. TAG as well as the ICOR liaison organization for ISO 292, which is entitled Security and Resilience, and am one of the authors of the ISO 22316 Organizational Resilience Principles and Attributes. We are also working on creating a few other standards to support that. And I'm also the author of ICOR's Certified Organizational Resilience series of courses that support our certification program. Our objective today is to understand strategies for leaders to implement in order to avoid burnout and prevent pandemic fatigue. The recording of the webinar will be available on the ICOR webinar page in a day or two. If you have questions, please use the questions button. We will answer the questions either during the webinar or in an email after the webinar, depending on how time goes. And all attendees will receive a certificate of attendance if you attend a minimum of 35 minutes. So let's get started. How are you feeling today? How many times a day do you get asked that question and you say, fine, when this is really how you're feeling? And I just thought I'd bring up, something from your childhood, and Pooh, yeah, Piglet, I'm tired of all this. And Pooh says, I am too, Piglet. I am too. And I think what we're all feeling is fatigued. I think that when I ask people how they're really feeling, the answer is, I am just tired. And this was kind of my joke, which is, it's been a long week, and this is me in the middle of Monday. So the second question is, how are you working today? Are you a parent with kids at home and you're trying to get your job done and keep your children either entertained or, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, your children engaged in their schoolwork as well? And just kind of a bit of humor as we're all kind of struggling, whether you're working alone or with your kids around you, this is maybe how our kids see us. We're on the computer, we're on the telephone, we're trying to get everything done, and that's what they're modeling. So I'd like to start with what we're actually talking about by burnout, because burnout isn't a new topic, but we're going to be looking at burnout in the context of the pandemic. So burnout is kind of the absence of mood volatility. I would say the closest definition that I think of is like being depressed. So you don't feel any excitement, you don't feel challenged, you don't want any new experiences, so you don't have a lot of emotional gain or loss. It's kind of a flatlining of our vital energies. And it can be the result of too much work. That's what you mostly hear about it, or you don't like the actual work that you have, the routine itself. Maybe you've got too many tasks and too few missions. There's a lot of reasons for typical workplace burnout. But we're going to look at really the impact of the pandemic on employee well-being. And McKinsey did a short study, and that what they found is that 75% of employees in the United States and close to a third in the Asia Pacific region are reporting symptoms of burnout. European nations are also reporting increased levels of pandemic fatigue. And the number of those who rate their mental health as very poor is more than 3 times higher than before the pandemic. And I would imagine that some of this is going to be impacted by the country that you're in and how well your country is handling things, and what has been your experience with lockdowns. There's some countries that have much less lockdowns and much less illness than others, and therefore that the the impact of the pandemic is much less, and therefore this whole fatigue issue is going to be much less correspondingly. So what does burnout look like? Well, lowered energy, a sense of feeling overwhelmed, being more negative than you normally are. And I actually kind of like this one. Nope, not today. Don't ask me to do anything more today. I'm just going to get done what's on my schedule. I'm not doing anything new. So when you think about it, burnout is not so much the presence of huge negatives as it is the absence of positives. And one distinct casualty of burnout is creativity. You really feel less creative. You're overwhelmed, and therefore it's hard to generate fresh ideas and perspectives. Just let me get through the day. So because your energy is being spent on coping, you really have very little left over for exploration and innovation. I want you to look at this and take this very seriously. So Eagle Hill Consulting also did a study about the emotional impact of a pandemic crisis. And I want you to consider that a mistake that many leaders make is treating burnout as a personnel issue when it's really an organizational issue. And this is true under pandemic conditions more than any other time. And because of this, leadership must actively manage the energy of their workforce. You cannot blame the personnel for being overwhelmed during these overwhelming times. And they need to cultivate the quality of employee relationships. So, a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is the softer side of work and the relationships and a lot about the culture of the organization. So, leaders must also demonstrate a capacity for resilience in order to recharge their organizations and all of its people during crises like this. When you're managing the emotional impact of a pandemic crisis, one of the things that is interesting is that it's a shared event. We're all kind of experiencing something similar, but we're being impacted differently. It's got uneven impact. So for example, some businesses are closed, and I'm assuming that if you're on this call today that you're still working, because why would you bother to attend this webinar if your business has been closed or if you're out of work due to the pandemic? But for a lot of you, some of you are on site part-time and others of you are home, or maybe you go to work 2 days a week, or maybe you're 100% home, but other people are 100% there, depending on what your work activities are. But for others of you, your business is growing and you have more work than ever because whatever your products or services are, they are something that's in need. So when you look and you ask the question, what has been the emotional impact of the pandemic on you, on your organization, as well as the other members of your organization? So this poll wants you to look at to what extent has your organization been impacted by the pandemic, and really consider how that kind of mirrors maybe how you're being impacted by the pandemic. So the question that Eagle Hill Consulting raised in December of 2020 was, are you feeling burnout at work? So we understand that millions of workers globally are facing these unprecedented circumstances. You're either working around the clock on the front line of the pandemic, or you are worrying about protecting your business or your job, or you're struggling to work from home. So remember that employee burnout was a problem before the coronavirus pandemic. And therefore, the risks of burnout now are painfully acute because we are having even more built on what you were having before. So what they found here is that 45% or 55% were not feeling burnout, but 45% were. And so tied to this is that they think that 25% of those people say that that's due to circumstances related to the pandemic, and 19% say that they're feeling burnout but not related to the pandemic. So everybody's experienced changes to your working life caused by COVID. So 45% people feel less productive, where 27% of people are actually feeling more productive. And this is really interesting because for those 27% 50% of people who feel more productive, we need to be considering what is making them more productive and how can we keep that after the pandemic. So what is it about working from home or however they're working during COVID that's making them more productive? And we need to capture those learnings. One of the biggest things that we're going to talk about today is this lack of connectiveness. So obviously 50% of people feel less connected. And I was kind of surprised by 20% the people feeling more connected. And that really could be because of um, companies that are actively working on keeping their people engaged. So that is something for us to consider as well, is we don't want to lose those things that we're doing. How can we build and grow and add to those things? So let's look at some of the causes of employee stress and fatigue. So some people are struggling to turn off at the end of the day since they no longer have that kind of change in environment to end the end of a workday. So, if you're just at your computer, sitting in whatever room of the house that you're in, you're not leaving. So that's one piece. Another piece of stress is, complaining about work and then feeling like you shouldn't be complaining because you're lucky to have it. A lot of people don't have the luxury of working remotely, or they don't even have the luxury of working at all. And so, because, I can say this, my job hasn't really changed that much, except that I'm working by myself, except with, instead of with my team. But essentially, my actual work, I'm in the office. I'm by myself, but I'm in the office, so my life hasn't changed that much. And so when I feel kind of overwhelmed, now I'm actually adding on guilt for feeling overwhelmed. So that is actually adding to stress and fatigue as well. So, according to a recent study, however, from the National Bureau of Economic Research in the US, they found that the average workday is actually 49 minutes or 48.5 minutes longer than it was before the pandemic, and that we have more meetings, up almost 13% more meetings. So these are some of the things that are causing some of this stress and fatigue. Forbes took a look and did a study to say, what are some other causes of this? And I think that the duration of the crisis is a primary cause. So we saw that in kind of the whole March, April, May, June time period, that things went pretty well. And we're going to look at some charts towards the end of this webinar that are going to talk to more address that. But there's things not working as well now. So you can run the same exact event or run the same exact meeting and find that what worked in April and May is not working in January. And so it is about the duration. Most of us are looking at a normal crisis that might last a few days or maybe a month or something. But this idea that we're going to be looking at this for some of you, depending on what country you're in, for 2 years or 18 months at minimum, um, that's a long time. And it's also really hard to maintain your productivity within and across your teams. It's much harder to work in a team when you're not seeing people. And I think this is the other real cornerstone of this, is managing the uncertainty. Most of us, when we talk about organizational resilience and being agile, it's all about managing change. But this idea of managing constant change and not being able to plan for the future because you have no idea what the future is going to look like, that combined with the duration and being secluded and remote from other people really makes this differently. We talked earlier about this idea that you don't leave your job and come home. So separating your work time versus your personal time, some people are finding that difficult to compartmentalize. It's harder for you to concentrate because there's so many distractions. I especially feel for parents whose kids are home, or if you're taking care of your parents or worrying about your own parents. All of these distractions can use up your emotional energy. It just even, in fact, if you've got multiple people working from home, you're a distraction to each other, trying to manage just the noise and the internet and all those kinds of things. We talked earlier about, what's working in March through June isn't working so much. Well, at first we embraced the technology that and the technology grew and we were able to do so much more with technology. And now we're like, not another Zoom meeting. And I'm not pushing anything against Zoom. We're just, it's been kind of the stereotype. And then, looking at stress from outside of work, it's not just the pandemic that's happening. We've got, depending on what country you're in, you might have political unrest. Everybody's feeling economic crunches. You're worrying about your family, whatever these factors are, there's a lot of things happening from outside of work as well. And of course, what do you normally do when you're stressed? You do some recreational activities, you go out with your friends, you socialize. And when we've cut off our way of relieving stress, this gains stress as well. So if you're not feeling pretty stressed and bummed out by now, um, you probably are just by listening to this webinar. So it is time to take care of yourself. So think about this statement. Suppose you had an employee that you supervised and you assigned that person the same tasks and expectations that you demand of yourself each and every day. How do you think that would work out? Well, most of you would reply, that wouldn't work out. I would never do that to someone working for me. So you need to be kind to yourself. You need to take care of yourself. You would never dream of talking to your friends or your work associates in the ways that you're talking to yourself. So make sure that you value yourself and manage yourself with as much respect and kindness as you would others. What are some other ways that you can take care of yourself? In this health blog, these are actually really common things. So I just picked out some of the common things across the different experts, but people are really writing more about this since September than maybe what we've seen in publications previously. It's been a topic. Emotional well-being and well-being itself is always a topic that companies need to consider, but during the pandemic, it's become much bigger. So one of the things that we were all gung-ho at the beginning, I can see people as well as talk to them. We've got our video conferences and we can see everybody. It's just like face to face. And understand that Zoom fatigue or, Teams fatigue, whatever you want to call it, or, go to meeting fatigue, these are serious side effects. So it's okay for you not to have your video conference on. If you're on a conference call with multiple people, you don't have to show your face. Put up a picture of yourself that you really like, or put up a cartoon, whatever you want to do. You do not have to be on all the time. So think about how you can minimize the stress of being on all of these video conference. And it also helps you to focus a little bit more about what people are saying, because if you're looking at someone online, it's not the same as meeting with them face to face, because you're also looking at yourself and you're looking at different screens. And so it's what they're saying is that it takes more energy to be on a conference call using the video than it is to be in an in-person meeting or just to be on a regular conference call. And you feel like you need to look good. And I am honestly, I don't know, but I always feel like I look better in person than I do on screen. So for those of you that look good on screen, go for it. But I have to say that um, part of what distracts me is I'm looking at my hair, I'm going, oh my gosh, I'm not sitting right. All of these things are distracting me from actually attending to what the people are saying. Now, some meetings are better with video if you've got a big department meeting or things like that, or if you're having some kind of a party, virtual party thing, of course those are important. But really consider, when can you turn off the video part? And you should practice saying no. Now, understand that not every company, not every organization has the culture where you can say no. But we do need to consider the fact, and when you're looking at the people that work with you, allowing them to say no. We're all worried about, if we're not productive enough, we might lose our job. We better work as hard as humanly possible. Or if I say yes to everything, my boss will value my work even more, and I won't be on that short list for layoffs. We've got a lot, there's a lot happening. But if you are becoming, so burned out and so stressed that you can't actually do your job, then you need to say no to something so that you can do something well. And so understanding that about yourself and about the people that you work with is really important. It's a vicious cycle. We don't have superpowers. And so again, you can say yes if this crisis is 30 days, but if it's 18 months to 24 months, you cannot say yes to everything. It's not sustainable, and that's part of why you're feeling exhausted. So if you can look at 10% of the things that you're supposed to do and figure out which one of those things are not critical, and figure out a way to say no to some of those things, see if that helps relieve some of your anxiety. We also need to reduce multitasking. So how many of you during this webinar are actually, checking your email, checking your phone, watching a second screen with something else on it? Um, that actually requires more energy. You might get it done in shorter time, but it's requiring more energy by doing these things at the same time, and you're not doing any of them well. There is actually a science that says you have to switch back and forth. You can't pay attention to more than one thing at a time. And so when you've got competing demands on your attention, you cannot stay present. So try it for a week or two and just try to focus on one thing at a time, and see if that helps reduce some of your anxiety. Here's a really good one. Remember I said earlier that our meetings are up by almost 20%? Well, schedule fewer meetings. So if you're the scheduler of meetings, try to consider, what meetings were you having pre-COVID, and what meetings are you having during COVID? And make some decisions. Are they all still necessary? Make sure you're intentionally inviting those people that only need to be there. And look at the duration of your meetings. Do they all need to be an hour? Is there a way that we can have shorter meetings that are more effective? And so when possible, try to um, substitute maybe a meeting with a really detailed email and then just a check-in, which really ties to taking micro breaks. You cannot sit at your computer all the time. So if you think about this is really talking about the remote worker right now, the people that are working from home. But it's important to take breaks. So when you're sitting in an office or you're sitting in a workplace, you are not sitting in front of your computer and not moving for 8 hours. You are getting up, you're getting a cup of coffee, you're chatting with somebody who walks by. There's all sorts of interactions. You're not eating at your desk, hopefully. Hopefully you're taking care of yourself during the pre-pandemic phase as well, but looking at ways that you can break up your day. And so maybe when you're scheduling your meetings, you schedule them for 45 minutes and make sure that there's not another meeting scheduled, so that you get a 15-minute break, so you can get up, move around, have time to process what was just in that meeting before you have to jump on the next one. If your calendar is packed, maybe you need to talk to, your colleagues or your boss to say, which meetings do I really need to be in? And consider that if you're the person setting up the meetings. The other thing that's really important is to stick to your pre-COVID work routine, even your commuting time. So if you have like a 20-minute commute, when you get up and before you get on your computer, what do you normally do during your commute? What radio station do you listen to? What podcast do you listen to? How do you entertain yourself? I love to listen to books on tape. That's my entertainment. So what do you normally do on both directions of your commute? Do that. Keep doing that. Try to stick to your work routine as much as you can. When do you normally go for lunch? Where do you normally go for lunch? Well, you can't do the where so much, but you can still have your lunch. So try to do the same sorts of things so that you're starting your day on a good foot and you're ending your day by being able to unwind before you have to jump into, taking care of your family, or, moving on to the next thing that you need to do. And don't check your email. Once you've left for the day, turn it off. I know it's impossible. You're being followed around with your phone and all those things, but the more we work during off work hours, the less we're taking care of ourselves. And the expectation is that you're going to be available. And if you're the person and you have other people working for you, you need to respect people's time. I knew someone who who would write up all her emails on Sundays because she just wanted to start the day fresh on Monday. But she would keep them in her drafts. And so she did not want over the weekend, if she was working, she did not want her employees to get these emails over the weekend and feel that they needed to be working as well. It was her choice of how she wanted to manage her time. But she kept those emails. And so I always laughed because I would get my emails at 8:30 in the morning. Every Monday morning, I'd have my kind of my, I knew it was exactly what was on her mind and where she wanted to go for that week. And then think about your body's energy rhythm. Normally you have a work day, whatever your work day is, whether you're a 9 to 5 or a 7 to 3, or you work the midnight shift or the dark, the night shift, whatever it is, now that you're working in different time periods, we do have the opportunity to take care of yourself. Like, I'm a much better worker in the evening than I am in the morning. I do not like jumping out of bed early. Other people, the earlier the better. So I would rather start a little bit later and work a little bit later. That's how I feel comfortable. But everybody's different. So if you have the opportunity, not, of course, not challenged by meetings that are scheduled the entire day, then see if you can take care of yourself by working when it's convenient to you, if that's possible. I don't think that's possible for everyone, but if it is, that's a great thing. And just like we talked about sticking to your pre-COVID routine, do something joyful that marks the end of the day. Figure out a way to be done with the day and um, just mark the end of the day. Don't make excuses for not finishing up. Remember, everybody's wearing multiple hats. We can't be perfect. So go easy on yourself and finish up your day on a positive note. So we talked about taking care of yourself, but you also need to take care of your employees. So as part of the Eagle Hill Consulting study that they did, they asked, what is your organization doing to help with employee burnout? And 36% said my organization isn't doing anything. This was amazing to me, that when everybody is experiencing so much stress, you would think that this would have been a much lower number. But we do have companies doing things. We've got companies increasing flexibility. I know, if you've got kids and before you were just getting them off to school and now you're having to get them into school and maybe be there with them, maybe you're starting your day really early and then taking a break, and you need to have no meetings scheduled while you're getting your kids set up. And maybe you want to have lunch with your kids. Maybe that's something that's new. You weren't able to do that before. So you don't schedule lunch meetings. That's your time with them. Whatever it is, however you can add flexibility to your employees, the better it'll be for them. We talked about lots of meetings, but meetings aren't communications. We're talking about communicating, talking to people. And we're going to talk more about that as well. And providing mental and physical wellness resources. I mean, this is huge. We're having a wellness pandemic. And so the more information that we can provide to our employees, the better it is for them. And maybe changing the goals and targets based on the situation. So maybe, instead of having your employees worrying about everything, you minimize what it is that they need to get done. So reducing some of the stress for them, if that's possible in your work condition. And tied to that is making workloads more manageable. So, but those are low numbers, 20, 19, 18%. Um, you know, Even during regular times, the top causes of burnout is your workload is too much, trying to juggle your personal and professional life, lack of communication, and time pressures. So that hasn't changed. It's just that the pandemic has made those things more acute. So think about, how have you been impacted by the pandemic? And, maybe personally as well as at work. And think about how it is that you can take better care of yourself and use what you've learned in your empathy with your employees as well. Because this is an international issue, it's a global issue, it's not just happening in your country, WHO put together a framework to counter COVID fatigue. And this was at the request of European member states. So this is something that you might want to take more of a look at. And so they define COVID fatigue as weariness. So kind of back to the poo thing, Piglet and poo. We're weary, And this pandemic has economic, social, and cultural implications. I mean, you get fatigued when you can't socialize with people, and talking on the phone or texting to people is not the same. So, just being able to hug people and spend time together is important. And so, the lack of that gives us that weariness. So, you need to understand your people. So, that's the very first thing that the WHO recommends. Collect and use evidence for targeted, tailored, and effective policies, interventions, and communication. Go and find out, and we'll talk some more about what those look like. Try to engage your people as part of the solution. What do they need? And this number three is a big deal. You know, help people reduce the risk, and here I'm assuming risk of getting sick while doing things that make them happy. How do you manage the risk of doing something that makes you happy, and that reward of it versus the risk of the fact that what you want to do might make you sick or you might make someone else sick? It's a tough thing. It really is. And so helping people to work through that and talk about that is really important. And then as an employer, you need to acknowledge the hardship people experience. So, even if it's maybe you don't even have any direct reports, but you've got work associates, just ask them how they're doing. Maybe it's not part of a work call, it might be during your work day, but you're not talking about a project. You're talking about how are they actually doing and the profound impact that the pandemic is having on their lives. We need to care and nurture each other. So some of the other things that they suggest is to encourage employees to communicate with you, your coworkers, and your supervisors. The organization can really facilitate this by also giving them time. Um, People don't have the time. That's part of the stressor. So how do you relieve that stressor? Give them time to communicate with each other. Create an environment where you can talk about stress impacts. Again, this isn't maybe possible at every organization. But if you're trying to improve your resilience and you're trying to make your culture better, this is one way to do it. So just talking about how the pandemic affects productivity at work. So if you're going to the workplace, how is the pandemic actually impacting your productivity? You know, it- Maybe just the fear of the fact that you're around other people is actually affecting your productivity and you don't feel safe. These are things that need to be talked about so that, leadership understands how people are feeling. Explore different ways that employees can stay in touch with your friends and family. Maybe you can recommend health resources. If you've got an employee assistance program, make sure people understand that it's there and that that's a confidential place that they can go to get help. Invite your employees to talk about aspects of their lives over which they don't lack control. This is scary, by the way. You know, Employees feel that if they share any way that they're vulnerable, it'll be used against them. So you need an environment and a culture where people feel okay to do this, and that then they need to trust that this information will be used to help you, not against you in any way. Again, we've talked about having a routine. So, getting your employees to maybe share their routines and what's working for them. Remind people, this is kind of that, what's your risk and reward piece, that their efforts to protect themselves and others matters to you. And even if the results, aren't clearly apparent, there's no way to know that you didn't infect anyone or that you've been a carrier, unless you get tested almost every day. It's very hard to know these things. So you're dealing with all of these unknowns. So as an employer, you just need to let them know that you care and that you're appreciating what they're doing to protect themselves. And of course, promote healthy work habits. Well-being should be part of every organization, and this should be a factor in keeping people healthy at your organization is promoting a healthy well-being. So when you prioritize employees' needs, this increases their productivity, their retention, and it fosters a sense of community. So this study or actually this interview that was done with McKinsey with Admiral John Richardson in the U.S. was really, really interesting. So we've included the reference here, and it'll also be included at the end of the presentation. But he was a really interesting, gave some really interesting insights. So the question was, teams are exhausted. They're going from one sprint to the next, thinking, okay, we'll get to that steady state soon. But the question is, what do you tell leaders who seem to be sprinting when this is really a marathon that we're in? And so his answer was, it's very important that the pandemic is not as temporary as we thought. We all thought we'd be out of this by June, and that the way things are right now is the way things are for the foreseeable future. And getting people to think about this as a marathon rather than a sprint. It's hard to predict when conditions are going to change. And so success really depends on managing the energy we have and conserving it for the long haul. So what do leaders need to do? Well, you need to trust your teams and delegate. The stakes are really high. And many leaders, when your leaders start thinking they have to be there all the time, make all the decisions, then when your leadership is burned out, now your organization is in real trouble. So you need to trust your teams and delegate, because otherwise you're going to start making mistakes. And so as leaders, you need to not only manage your own energy, but you need to focus on managing your team's overall energy, which means you need to help them balance the load. Maybe you need to restructure your teams because certain people aren't as available as they normally are because of new expectations and responsibilities they have under these conditions. So it might be as simple as looking at your people and asking them about their availability and what they can do, and trying to balance that load so you don't have a bunch of people all available working on one team and another team is really struggling to produce anything because they just are overwhelmed. So looking at that capacity and how to distribute that. So you need to have an understanding of your own capabilities that your organization have. What are the strengths and limitations of your team so that you can structure them for long-term performance and resilience, and understanding that everyone needs a break and a time to refresh. So whether that means, and I've heard a lot of companies are doing things like giving more time off, more PTO, just saying, you don't have to tell us, just say, you can't do it today. And just building that in just to help people take a break and refresh. So that's kind of leads into the next question, which is, how can leaders provide relief? What can be done to get people to rest? And this is actually like, how can you force them to rest? Well, this goes back to this being able to accept that there's not going to be a quick solution or recovery. We don't know what the end will look like or when it will come. As now that we have vaccines and they're coming to different countries and different communities in different times, there's a lot of unknowns there. We know it's coming, but we don't know when, and we don't know at what point there'll be enough of us vaccinated where it's safe for everybody to get together. So that's part of our challenge. And so recovery is really essential to mission effectiveness. So you need to make sure people rest. So try to manage what's in your span of control. Set realistic personal and team goals and just work to achieve those goals. If they need to be minimized, it's better that you'll get out really good productivity than to than on less things than it is to do not very well on a lot of things. So how can you, keep that communication going and try to keep that team connected and together? I think about the fact that, just sitting in our small office, all of the creativity that comes by just somebody having an idea and, turning around and mentioning it to the next person, and all of a sudden we've all stopped what we're doing and we're saying, that's great, how about this, how about that? You can't, it's really hard to do that when everything is remote. And so whatever we can do to help with that will be really important. And this will help you retain or even strengthen that agility that teams have. And it will allow teams to respond to conditions as they change. So, if we really need everybody on board right now, then we have everybody on board right now, but understanding that, okay, you all gave it your all, we can now take a break. We got that project done. We need to do that. So one of the things that Admiral John Richardson said is that, leaders they actually need to work harder to keep your team connected. And those, working on those things that are within your control. And so looking at this more gentle oversight can be more effective than maybe during normal times. So looking at soft subjective assessments of your person's or team's emotional state, maybe moving away from those hardcore, more quantitative assessments that you might do normal times. It's certainly harder to do those things via video teleconference. So, you know, don't it maybe doing assessments aren't as important right now, as these soft assessments are about finding out how people are doing. So one of the things the Admiral said was that as a leader, you need to make a point of being present, being attuned to your team, and really talking to them and learning about what they're going through. So in the Navy, they call this walking the deck plates. Get away from your desk and talk to your people physically if possible, but obviously, virtually for most of us. And make sure that you've got empathy. Make sure that you're approachable and empathetic because that makes a certain kind of magic. So if everybody is doing this, it really can contribute to your understanding of how things are going. So when we're looking at re-energizing for the long run, Albert Einstein mentioned that, in the midst of every crisis lies a great opportunity. So we need to know that recovering from the pandemic is more than just about coping. Organizations have the opportunity to do more than just get through it. So restoring the performance and work life enjoyed, before the crisis, it's going to take a little bit work. And so how can we actually do more than just get through it? Many employees already have the sense that we aren't likely to bounce back, but we need to actually bounce forward. We don't want to go back to the way things were. We want to learn from what we've been through to make things better and to bounce forward. So we need to consider the fact that the pandemic and how we've responded to it is likely to result in more permanent shifts in how we do things, whether it's consumer preferences, buying behaviors, different business models, and of course, ways of working. So while forging ahead into something new introduces its own uncertainties, it also offers the promise of building on pandemic-related accomplishments. And here's where we need to actually stop. And if you haven't done this with your organization yet or with your team, maybe it's a really good time to say, look at what we have accomplished. We've moved to a more flexible and innovative working model. We have implemented new technologies in weeks rather than months or years. We've empowered our teams. We have stripped down unnecessary bureaucracy, and we are making faster decisions even amid uncertainty. So just really celebrating what you've managed to accomplish under really stressful condition is important, and it helps people to re-energize to recognize that. So when you're saying, you're already seeing a potential for growth and renewal because some organizations have started operating differently during the pandemic and they're seeing that this is a way they're going to operate in the future. We need to take our lessons learned and keep those things. And a lot of companies that have viewed the pandemic as an opportunity to migrate from digital technologies are now leading their industries and outperforming peers. So there are companies that are doing much better than their peers because of how they've been able to manage this change and take advantage of the opportunities. We've talked a little bit about empathy and compassion, but companies are finally waking up to that need to have more empathy and compassion, to create a workplace that can unleash the full potential for their people, even beyond the crisis. Global trends were already starting to turn the old rules of industrial age management on their heads, introducing new and more human-centered principles that truly put talent and people at the heart of organizational success. So if you can move to being more intensely human or nurturing the very best elements of emotion, creativity, human connection, and empathy, and being able to inspire emergent leadership at every level, your organization is going to be not just re-energized during this pandemic, but they're going to come out ahead once we're done with all of this. So more than ever, companies are more open to trying new things and working differently as they seize the opportunity to emerge stronger. So learning from this period of grief and disillusionment to create a brighter future for their employees and organizations alike is really, really important. So I want to take a look back and kind of look at what things look like at the beginning of the pandemic. Because COVID-19 has challenged our beliefs about what the future will hold. So when the pandemic began, many organizations and their employees mustered the energy and determination to respond fast and surprisingly well to this unprecedented challenges. So here you can see on the very left, you've got this pre-crisis, and we had kind of a warning threat, and you have some impact. Then we move up and we have this historic response, and then we have this community cohesion, kind of a honeymoon period. Companies rightfully stepped up by focusing on their employees' health and safety as they muddled through a difficult set of threats and uncertainties. Many organizations saw their leaders also at all levels step up to the challenge, and they focused on those most critical issues demanded by the situation. They banded together and they, again, responded heroically and selflessly to support colleagues and customers and communities. And initially, remember, there was that novelty of working from home, and many employees were pleasantly surprised by how much they could do. Remembering those people who said they actually are getting done more. And as teams mobilized to respond to the crisis, morale was buoyed by, leaders' inspirational messages and actions showing that we can get through this together. But then came the period of disillusionment. Many months later, with no clear end in sight, and I think we really saw this kind of over the summer, June, July, and August, people were able to be outside more. It depends, obviously it depends on where you live, but kind of in the northern hemisphere, we were able to be outside more, being able to do some things. And then came September, and schools were closed in a lot of our countries, and we're back to being inside. And with no clear end in sight, kind of that adrenaline rush that we had and those high energy sprints has definitely faded. So now we're back to this kind of sprinting again through this marathon. And we find ourselves in this disillusionment phase and understanding that now we've jumped, from this kind of honeymoon time down over time we've suffered. And now it's almost like we're working through a grief. You see those bumps, and trying to, look at that post-crisis future where we can reimagine and construct what that new normal might look like. So the question becomes, how can we navigate through disillusionment more effectively and come out successfully on the other side faster? So part of this disillusionment is natural. No matter what the crisis is, not just a pandemic crisis, just maybe just losing a loved one all by itself. Everybody kind of bands together at the beginning, and then you have to work through those grief stages. It's very similar to moving through a crisis. And we have to understand that there are stages to go through. So, but it can be really distinct from general disappointment and sadness. And this is when your deeply held beliefs and expectations are challenged by the circumstances. What you believed was true isn't true, or people are feeling like their assumptions have been shattered and not being able to depend on what the future is going to hold. We all thought we'd be back at the workplace by now. So, I mean, a lot of you are, but not all of us. And many of us are feeling more isolated than ever. When we thought about work-life balance in the past, this is a lot harder now than it was before. Excuse me. This idea of not understanding when it's going to end is what's making that um, more difficult. And remember, compounding this disillusionment is the grief from what we've lost, which for some has been deeply profound. Back to the kind of feeling guilt. In my immediate family and friends, I've had people that have had COVID, but they've all recovered. And most of us have kept our jobs. It might not be the same, but we've been able to do that. And so that's not true for everyone. And so we need to recognize the profound loss that many people have had, and that the feelings of isolation and uncertainty are a major source for our exhaustion. So it's really imperative for leaders to recognize this and help people help their people to lead with hope. Um, and puts a lot of responsibility on leadership as well to be able to get through this. So McKinsey has put together kind of 5 strategies. And the first one is called bounded optimism. And it's the antidote to disillusionment. So to try to level that slope of the downward curve and to emerge, stronger, faster, we need leaders to act with bounded optimism. So this means they need to display inspiration and hope and optimism. However, it needs to be tempered by reality and help their people make meaning out of the circumstances by creating an understanding of what's happening and what responses are appropriate. Just even talking about the company, this is how we're going to approach the next 3 months. And this is where I need you to focus. Put some boundaries on things and say, we will get through this, but this is our strategy for doing so. Even just communicating what the strategy is gives people hope. It also gives them meaning, which helps builds confidence and helps with your endurance. And it also can serve as kind of a balm if that outcome takes longer or is different from what's expected. So, you can say, we thought this was going to take us 3 months to get to this goal. It's actually, we think it's going to take us 6 months. So we're going to keep going as we have. But I don't want you to worry, things are still in place. So whatever you can do to give your people and your company inspiration and hope and optimism, but making sure it's bounded in reality. So when you embrace this bounded optimism, that's really what it is. It's optimism that's bounded in reality. You're more successful to communicate hopeful messages that are less about returning to normal and more about accepting where you're at. So if you look at the purple line here, what you're seeing is that when companies or leaders responded with overconfidence um, and couldn't deliver, and they weren't addressing psychological needs, the company is much less likely to even get back to normal. And so the theory here is that if you respond with bounded optimism, that your low isn't going to be as low and your time that it takes you to get back to normal is going to be faster, and that you can come out of this ahead of where you were before. You need to relay the fact that we're not likely to go back to the way we were, but we're going to come back better. And how do we do that? One of the things, there was an interview done for a U.S. Navy Vice Admiral James Stockdale, and he was a prisoner in Vietnam when he was a captain. And his challenge was to communicate to his fellow prisoners a sense of hope in a very difficult situation. And he later said that those who felt that they would be home by Christmas, whatever time that was, maybe it was July or maybe it was March, whatever time period it was, they fared much worse mentally than those who understood that it might take longer and they adjusted. So many of his fellow prisoners later credited his message of optimism, tempered by realism, with helping them to survive. In some cases, as a leader, you may need to admit that you started off with a bad set of assumptions. We all want to get back to normal, and we all want to tell people what they want to hear. But in reality, we need to embrace bounded optimism and quantify some of that. And it also helps as a leader to have your integrity and authenticity, because we don't want to lose the trust. And this idea that it's going to help us to be stable is really, really important. So we also need to listen deeply for signs of exhaustion or other natural responses to stress. We talked earlier about connecting with your people. One of the most challenging parts of this crisis, we know that, is that there isn't a perfect plan to re-energize. There really just isn't one. And so leaders who accept this fact they're better able to manage the energy and mood of their organizations and be more adaptive, which allows them to discover maybe some new ways to their solutions. So you need to have a more holistic and deeper form of listening than maybe you've done in the past. So in one organization, they implemented what was called they implemented leader listening tours, and they trained their executives on listening skills before meeting with colleagues across the organization. They helped their leaders to talk less and listen more. And they sent that powerful message to allow their employees to tell them how they were really doing. We talked about this earlier and how important that is. This is a level of trust. And so training your leadership to be able to tell people that it's okay to not be okay and how can we help you is a very good um, way to start. Another organization sent its top executives on a listening tour to better understand the work from home employees experience. And those executives said that within minutes, employees opened up about their growing self-doubts as valued team members and their dwindling sense of belonging in the organization. You know, at the office, when we have informal encounters with peers or gossip at the water cooler, as we call it, that gives us a sense of connection. These back-to-back video calls have really left us feeling more disconnected than ever. So leaders need to create space in their calendars for informal connections. We've said this before, but trying to summarize this up, it's really, really important. So whether you're, using a rapid listening session for crowdsourcing or using technology, whatever it is, we need to find ways of hearing from our people and managing the energy of others, and to start making employees feel heard. These executives said that they just felt shame for not understanding and then pride at what some of the people were doing. And they really wanted to help their employees to do better. And so it's not just how the organizations listen, it's also how often. Remember that whole banding together at the beginning? We need to be doing this regularly. You need to continually listen. You need to take a regular pulse on how everybody's doing, even if you only have responsibility for yourself and your team. Make that part of what you do. And we understand that moods and needs are going to fluctuate. And as different people get sick, things are going to fluctuate. And so we just need to be sensitive to that. We also need to help um, our people develop adaptability and resilience skills. So there's been research done out of the University of Calgary, and he said there's really three archetypical responses to being sick. This is with the medical profession. You've got those people that yearn to go back to the way things were. They're sick. They're not going, they have to, it's a chronic thing. And so they want to go back to and just talk about the way things were before their illness. Instead of dealing with how things are during the illness, they just want to talk about, you know, how much better their lives were before. Then you've got people who've lost sight of the past and can't even imagine who they would be in the future because they could only exist in the right now because they're in the middle of this chaos and they can't look back and they can't look ahead. And then we've got those that embrace kind of that quest narrative where they're able to meet their unchanging circumstances head on by accepting them and incorporating them as part of their identity and their journey. And unsurprisingly, of course, the patients who thrived with their chronic conditions chose a third level, and they see the illness as the occasion of the journey that becomes part of the quest. Can't emphasize enough, we need to focus on care, connection, and well-being. So there needs to be, that same myriad of things that we did at the beginning, we need to continue. We need to make sure people have time to recharge and recover, and we need leaders to legitimize and actively role model that. So when you think of well-being as a holistic concept, the more that can be done, there's just so much more that we can be doing. So we need to place greater emphasis now more than ever on fostering and nurturing that human connection and caring. And don't forget to assess those. And then what we've really seen is an unleashing of energy by evolving the organization's operating model. So what we've seen is the most effective leaders see COVID-19 crisis as a way to reimagine the post-pandemic organization. And they're really doing this in three ways. They're operationalizing and activating the purpose. They're reimagining the workplace, and workforce of the future. and they're creating a faster and more flexible organizational structure. And all of these things we've talked about in past ICOR webinars about being more agile and adaptive and building more resilience into your organization. And so we now have case studies of organizations that have been able to do this during the pandemic. So trying to operationalize purpose, making it a core component on how companies work, can really help organizations and employees focus on what really matters. Remember, we talked about narrowing the scope of what you're doing so that you're spending more time on activities that directly delivered on the organization's purpose and strategic value, and you're spending less time on things that are peripheral. So part of that is when everyone is clear not only on what the organization's doing, but also on why it's doing it, it's really easier to strategically prioritize things and to identify what work you can delay, which meetings can be skipped, and which decisions are just good enough for right now. We don't need to worry about them. So all the things we talked about earlier in this webinar are kind of coming together here with some of this information. And all of this helps us to empower others. When it turns out that many decisions not only aren't made at the right level anyways, but are also part of the challenge of pushing decisions down, so that it helps people make them lose sight of what that larger purpose and that strategic North Star is. And so this kind of decentralization and flattening of the organization and empowering others is really, really important. So aligning the organization on what really matters, the strategic value agenda, like we just said, and that higher purpose, helps the organization to not only inspire, through inspiration and meeting, but also helps by delegating and empowering people, helps you to move faster, strategically prioritize, and take less important things off the plate. We need to do that. What they have found is that agile organizations were roughly 2 times as fast as their peers in reacting to this crisis. And things like moving from an annual planning cycle to a quarterly planning cycle with a 90-day cadence to learn from what was accomplished past cycle, and then to set priorities as needed, dynamically flowing resources, both people and capital, to where they're needed most. And then seeking to build a more meaningful culture of empowerment by streamlining their decision governance, pushing decisions down to that network of empowered teams is also important. And so, organizations that are able to create value by acting with unprecedented speed and by creating an environment in which employees are encouraged to bring their talents to bear, and by opening up capacity for leaders to spend more time caring for and connecting with their teams, is really at the cornerstone of unleashing this energy. So you need to re-energize your organization, and responding to this crisis is a defining leadership moment. And by exploring these 5 ways to re-energize your organization, leaders can help individuals view work as a place where they can grow personally, nurture their talent, and live their purpose. So we don't want you to simply survive through this, but you need to thrive and win on the turn and try to emerge more human-centered, more innovative, and better positioned to adapt to the challenges ahead. So we need to embrace that quest to move forward. So when you're doing this, it helps this ability to grow and develop, especially during times of change and stress, should become a new and high priority muscle for leaders to build. Looking at adaptability, this is one of the top 2 capabilities identified by senior executives as crucial for supporting their organization's growth and recovery. So how do you make people more adaptable? And you also need inspirational leadership. So leaders need to seize this opportunity to cultivate more of a learning mindset in their people and organizations, and specifically focus on building resilience and adaptability now and for the future. Upskilling, in other words, providing some training on adaptability and resilience, it can be a really powerful way to improve well-being at the same time, which in turn has been shown to improve creativity, innovation, engagement, organizational speed, and performance, which is really where we're at. And they found that organizations that invest in the well-being and energy of their people see 4 times higher profit and more than 20% gains in productivity and innovation. They are also better prepared to handle shocks such as COVID-19 or other business model disruptions with greater speed and resilience that might happen in the future. So remember that although we all start at different levels, much about the adaptability and resilience is malleable. In other words, we can teach this. So many organizations have launched tech-enabled capability building programs for leaders and their organizations to scale resilient and adaptable behaviors to grow those things. So instead of our final poll today, what I'd like you to do is in the post-webinar survey, please share any experience and learnings that you might have had. And what we're going to do is combine those and share them, of course, anonymously, so that we can all learn from each other. We're going to skip the questions today because I did run over, but I strongly recommend that you take a look at these references, and you'll be able to see this with the recording. So you can take a look at some of these references in more detail. And I just want to remind you on February's webinar, our theme this year is building resilience. And so, looking at what is your organization's COVID exit strategy? What are their plans for coming out of this? And really the importance of how leaders are leading during these uncertain times. And so whether you're in the respond phase and what kind of triggers are you going to have for moving to recovery, or maybe you're already in the recovery phase. And if not, what will it look like? And we're understanding that it's probably going to be a series of activities versus kind of like we're back to normal now. We're going to move back into our building. That's probably not how it's going to be. And then looking at renewing. What is the new normal? And what will your organization look like post-pandemic? So we do have our series this year is on building resilience during and after a pandemic. So we'll be looking in March for rebuilding for speed. In April, reimagining the post-pandemic workforce. In May, the workplace. And then in June, we're going to be looking really at the different strategies. It isn't a plan, it is a strategy. And then in July, we're going to look at capability building and how you can help people to be more resilient, to be more agile and adaptive, which then ties to the August one, which is looking at building agility and flexibility across the entire organization, and the impact in September of individual purpose, how that impacts all of those pieces. And then kind of drilling down in October to risk culture and operational resilience, how you can manage risks through your global value chains. We've talked a lot about supply chains, but what about value change? And then kind of summarizing it all up with how culture shapes behavior to build more resilient organizations. We encourage you to follow us, on LinkedIn and Facebook. We don't do a lot on Twitter, but we do post a lot on YouTube as well. So check out our newsletter and our network. Thank you very much for attending today.